I think of risk. Risk is always a risk-reward analysis. And when you have that liquidity, what does that give you as a jumping off point for other sorts of things? So liquidity, meaning you have cash in the bank, you can pay down all the debt that you've taken. It's sort of, there's not only the financial debt, but there's all the emotional debt. You put all of this time away from your friends and family and other sorts of things. Unless you plan on hanging it up, then you've got to then say, and probably the best place ever to take a big risk now. I'm as young as I'm ever going to be. I'm likely as healthy as I'm ever going to be. Have a little bit of capital on the side, and then I can probably start over.
I find the opposite to be true. I find entrepreneurs that took incredible risks to do what they did, once they become liquid, they become super conservative. And they're like, now I'm going to go all protection and everything has to be protected. And it took me so much work to get there. And I'm like, I say, I understand. But I love the idea of saying maybe some has to go into reserve, but take a big swing as well. Before we get started, I wanted to pause and thank you. The fact that you're watching or listening means the world to me. None of this would be possible without you. And every time you subscribe, every comment you leave, every episode you share, it allows me to keep having these conversations with people I never imagined I'd sit across from. So if you haven't already, please do hit the subscribe, tap the bell so you never miss an episode, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. This podcast is a journey we're building together, and I couldn't do it without you. Eric went from building billion-dollar digital products inside AOL and Microsoft to fighting for overlooked founders at the face of change of TV and in venture capital. But behind the headlines is a man who knows what it's like to be underestimated and how costly that can be. Eric, I am very, very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, Ahmad. It's good to be here.
Let's start with, what story about money or success did you inherit growing up, and how has that shaped your work at ImpactX?
So growing up, I grew up in the time, and I was born during the time of the civil rights movement in the United States, in the very deep South, but in a sort of a cosseted community, because it was a university community, one of the historically Black colleges and universities. For those who don't know, in the United States, education had been segregated by race for decades. And so there had been a number of universities and colleges of higher education that had actually been built in order to educate people who could not get into other universities. And this is universities everywhere from Harvard straight through to a local or even a state university in the United States. And so my family was actually on the campus of Tuskegee. Then it was an institute. Now it's called Tuskegee University, started by a former enslaved person named Booker T. Washington, very famous and one of the most famous people of his time, who put together the money and the backing from mostly white Northern industrialists to start this training ground for Black people in the South. The very, very deep South. So this is Alabama. And anyone who knows sort of the United States history knows that Alabama has been sort of a hotbed for a number of things related to everything from the enslavement of people of color straight through to Jim Crow and the civil rights movement to Martin Luther King and a lot of what he was doing in terms of his time. But I think the thing which is the most interesting story for me about catalytic capital, and for me, money is money, right? Money is fungible. Money buys things. Money provides access. It's hard and soft power. But I think the story of Booker T. Washington and how he actually started this university, what became a university, based on gathering capital from sources who might not have been thought of as the sources that would do this kind of thing, and persuading them that if we had one population of the United States or a whole group of people who were in the country and were not able to contribute to the height of their ability because education was not going to be offered to them in a way that had been fair and equitable, even though they paid taxes and did other sorts of things through their state systems, that indeed there needed to be an alternative approach, and that would actually lead to the betterment of the world. So I guess I would say that for me is a conversation about catalytic capital at a very trying time and from very unlikely sources.
Incredible story. and a powerful reminder of how capital can unlock so much value, but at the same time, how it takes a brave leader, someone that can talk with vision and convince unlikely capital sources to do an experiment that I'm sure at the times seemed like completely unfathomable.
I imagine if we imagine back for a group of people who didn't have the right, and in fact, in some places, it was actually illegal to even read and write. And to go from that to the basis of most education that is not sort of apprenticeship oriented is around the ingestion of information through reading. And then you're tested on that. And that's often through writing that you're conveying how you have ingested that information. So it is, I think, it's an audacious goal that what we're going to do is we're going to be a generation from that state of absolute inability legally, so de jure segregation, to be able to then say that there is going to be a investment in education and that we're going to not see that investment pay off. I mean, many people want an investment to pay off immediately, but that this will pay off not only in the relative short term, but then over generations. So for me, I think it is always interesting and inspiring to have an audacious goal under terrible and inauspicious circumstances and to be able to create something that then is world changing. That's a good reason to even be in venture and to be a venture investor, looking for those same sorts of opportunities. Maybe not in the educational context and building those sorts of institutions, but certainly building out fantastic companies.
What an incredible example to grow up and that ideal and someone being so inspirational. You went on to become the COO at Touch Surgery and Medtronic. What was it like? What made you successful in the corporate world? What do you feel people don't understand of being a CEO of such a big company?
I would say that, so Medtronic bought our company. And so I never got the chance to be COO of Medtronic. That would be nice, which is, a publicly listed US company that does tens and tens of billions annually in terms of turnover. But, I was part of a very successful organization that was in the cutting edge of technology. That organization, Touch Surgery, which actually changed the name to Digital Surgery just as we were being purchased. That organization was trying to solve a fascinating problem because in the world, there are about 5.5 billion people who don't have access to safe surgery. So think about that. There are 9 billion people in the world, and 5.5 of those don't have access to sort of the basic levels of safe surgery. And for a variety of reasons. The surgeons aren't present in the space. The surgeons who have been trained decide to go practice in the United States or someplace in Europe, and they don't come necessarily back to their communities. Whatever it is, that is something which creates a real problem for a variety of reasons. And so the people who started Touch Surgery, and I joined them back in 2016, those young men said that, who were both have been trained as surgeons, they said, look, there has to be a better way to train train surgeons, because the catch point and the pinch point is that there are not enough surgeons that are actually being trained. The interesting thing is, although we then had a solution that was helping to train surgeons more quickly, which was a simulated and gamified approach to training surgeons. So you could download it from, and I think you still can download it from the Google Play Store, and then also and also through the Apple Store. These games that we created that were hundreds and hundreds of surgeries that had many, many steps and sort of detailed representations to help people to learn from step 0 to step 7,000, what are the things that you need to do to get a safe surgery such that you reduce the likelihood of readmission and or some sort of other problem that's created if you don't use what is a really gold standard. And by teaching people and using things other than live animal demonstrations or using cadavers or an apprentice model, which has you sort of looking at someone do something, then you assist them doing something, then you do something and have them assist you, and then you do it on your own, instead of using that apprentice model, which is not very scalable, this is a scalable approach. So that organization grew and developed and eventually gained the attention of Medtronic, but in an interesting space, because toward the end of my time there, before I left to start my venture capital firm, ImpactX Capital Partners, we had decided that what we would need to do is not just train a surgeon at a time to use this sort of tool. What we would actually do is want to get into the operating room and take away the need for a person to have to remember all the steps in a surgery, and actually have a tool that would advance through, and for everyone in the surgical team, which could be dozens of people, depending upon how complex it is, well, at least maybe up to a dozen people, sort of what does everyone need to know as the step that we're on now? What's the step that preceded? What's the step behind? What's likely to be asked for in terms of equipment? What is likely to be the kind of reading that we're going to look for in terms of sort of the technology that's in the operating theater in order to help us to monitor what's going on, and then to be able to progress through in a way that is very, very efficient and much more likely to get good outcomes than not. That became the basis for the company that bought us of a robotics approach. And that is the true way to actually get scalability, where you can get those 5.5 billion people to have safe surgery. Don't just rely upon training more people who become world-class surgeons. Don't just have people who are nurses and practitioners and doctor practitioners to then learn how to do this by following instructions. Instead, why don't we use those as workflows for robots? And so whether the doctor is going to be there and the robot's going to be assisting, or whether they're autonomous robots that are working, if they follow this work plan, and we use things like computer vision, a type of artificial intelligence, in order to be able to distinguish what is tissue, what is a vessel, what is unhealthy, what is healthy, we're in a position to be able to then get a number of these sort of tools into hospital spaces, and then to be able to do that work. And the great thing about robots and the great thing about artificial intelligence, they never take vacation. They never had a bad night because the baby was crying. They never have an argument. They never want to all they want to do is get the operation done correctly. And so we think that that is, and of course, Medtronic agrees with that that's the wave of the future. So that's the kind of organization that I was in. But your question was really sort of, how did I get there? And I think the best answer is, that was sort of the fourth company that I was part of that exited as a venture-backed company to a public company in the United States. So that wasn't the first place that I landed. I didn't land at a sort of a high-flying, fast-growth health tech, sort of superstar in the UK just by chance. It didn't happen just one day. I'd had one other in the UK, and then two in the United States, that these companies that had grown, scaled, and then actually exited to public companies in the United States. And before that, I'd spent time as a founder myself of an organization that we actually were founded during the dot-com boom and then bust. And so then went bust. And then I'd spent time as a strategy consultant. Before that, I'd gone to law school. So there are a bunch of things that made it possible for me to transition from the segregated South to running a company that was interesting enough in London in order to be purchased by an American company, to be at the cutting edge of the use of artificial intelligence, as well as the cutting edge of robotics for human intervention. So I would say there are a lot of steps.
It's ultra inspiring, especially because these are, I think, at the height of venture capital, and when money was cheap and everybody was having funding and everybody could get funding with an idea. Most ideas were a gizmo, an app, a smaller problem to solve, almost like I'm going to build a calendar for gym memberships or whatever it was, something a little bit simpler. What you were doing is really changing the world. And I'm glad that I asked about your childhood and this example that you gave, because now I see your perspective. Let's go a little bit deeper into the steps, because I feel that even though there are a lot of steps, you did get there. Mm-hmm. Which one or which path drew you closer, and which story can you tell us that perhaps you would have liked to avoid it?
That's an interesting question. I would say, if you grow up in the world, the United States, right? And in the United States, we are a country built on the backs of a bunch of different dynamics. Indigenous people who are removed from their land and unincorporated and moved into reservations and repopulated and resettled other places. Bodies that are unpaid to do heavy lifting and to not have autonomy, not have the right to vote and that sort of thing. And that's Black people. We've had, a situation where women didn't have the right to participate fully. They could marry and they could certainly be part of, and this is women of all ages, colors, and stripes. That's the United States, right? And then out of that comes a very fantastic democracy, but a democracy that has its dynamics. It's not the biggest democracy, that's India, of course, but it is a very, very well-known democracy and one to which a number of people point either favorably or unfavorably. So if that's my upbringing and it is my experience that is how I think the world should exist, it became very clear when I left the bosom of family with, a lot of advantages tied to me and went out into the world that I found, not that I was likely, but I found a number of encumbrances and a number of roadblocks that I didn't necessarily always have tools to fight. So, for instance, when I went for my first set of interviews. So I went to undergrad, and in the United States, for those people who don't know the American education system, you go to secondary school, which is the equivalent of high school, what we call high school, but the equivalent of secondary school in other systems. And then at about 18 on average, you head off to your final sort of matriculation, which is at a place which is of higher education called a university or a college. A university means that it has graduate departments. A college means that it has undergraduate program only. And so I went to a university, and at that university, I was, one of about 10% of the class that was made up of people of color, Black people, not even people of color. There are more than that. But if we talk about Black people from various parts of the world as well, and people who would have originated in the African diaspora, there are a lot of us there. And that was such an interesting community to see the people who flew in on private jets because their parents were those kinds of people, to see those who'd been first generation in university and college, that this had been sort of the first time that anyone from their family had actually sought higher education. All of that was very interesting to me because at some point, all of those differences, those geographic differences, those socioeconomic and political differences broke apart, and this group becomes a unifying whole because we're all facing a similar kind of an issue. Some of it might be considered, you mentioned in your introduction this question of underestimation. Some of it might have been that I went to Princeton University because you wanted to study engineering. You were the smartest mathematics person in your school. You were the best physics student in your community. You were the highest achieving chemist in your state. Then you get to Princeton, and the conversation is never explicitly, well, you're not the right person for this. The point is often, you're not the search image that we would have expected. Think about investing. When you think about who is going to create the next breakout technology, whether it be in fintech or whether it be in artificial intelligence, and you say to yourself, what does that person look like? Who is going to do this? Does that person often come to mind? Is that person a Black woman who started off in a housing estate? Is that your image as to who is going to solve that problem? And that she lives in Europe or that she lives in Zambia? Generally, I think people feel, and I might also be this kind of person, that the people who are going to really solve the problems look a certain way, but that's not what they look like. I don't know what they look like, but they certainly don't look like her. And so it would be very surprising if she were that person. Likewise, when I got to school, the dynamic that we all face, and the thing which broke down some of these barriers among the students of color, was that the idea that you were going to be the leading and the student who was really going to break the code in the computer lab was just an idea that seemed probably a little bit alien. You might be top of class in your English department. You might be the top because you might be a fantastic creative writer. You might be an absolutely sensational person in politics. But the idea that you were actually going to be sort of that leading scientist in organic chemistry and other things, that's something that hit very hard. And when I say it hit very hard, it was never said to me. and I don't believe anyone else received that. No one received that as the explicit feedback, but it is the mountain against which they pushed. And we pushed all the time, which continues to exist. And as I mentioned, as I gave you in this example, sort of who do we really think is going to solve the streaming, the streaming opportunity, or is going to create the most breakout agentic AI solution? Probably out of Silicon Valley, probably a guy, and probably in most people's minds, they're not going to be a person of color, unless they might come from India or China. Then that's a possibility. But otherwise, that's unlikely to come from the Middle East, unlikely to come from Malaysia or Thailand, but guess where they probably do come from. So those are some of the things. So I think about that. I think about that as being one of those experiences. And it doesn't give you an exact experience, but it gives you sort of the context of where many experiences happened.
I think it's so interesting the way that you brought it up, because I think it's something that people try to normalize. Like, no, the best idea wins. The one with more merit wins. But I am a person of two cultures in my house. I'm Latino and I am Persian. And when I went to university, I had imposter syndrome a lot because I studied statistics and the usual suspects were there. And I remember looking at my sister and this Peruvian guy, and we looked at each other like, are we supposed to be there? Or, like, it was a little bit of society tells us that we didn't belong. And incredibly, my sister became the first student of this class. And I don't want to say prove them wrong, but we started from behind ourselves. Like, it was like a self-imposed thought of imposter syndrome. Like, why are we becoming actuaries when all the people around us are not like us?
And that imposter syndrome, the thing that I think is fascinating about it is I bet you grew up in a circumstance around a fight mentality. And at least I did. So I'm not sure whether you and your sister did, but I did. This idea, so my parents, my parents were part of the university faculty. So they obviously knew about academia. They knew that in going not to Tuskegee, but to go to Princeton was going to have a very different dynamic. The professors in class, whereas at Tuskegee, they would have mainly been, if not, and they wouldn't have exclusively been, but most of them were going to be Black, probably Black American and from Africa and the Caribbean. This was going to be a whole different group of people. And we hadn't lived in isolation. It's not as though we lived, in some other sort of utopian culture. The fight was, you have to bring the fight. You get the fight every day. There is not a moment when you're not fighting. That's called vacation. I know other people take holiday. For us, if you're not fighting, it's like, great. So today is a day I don't have to actually go out with my armor on. So it was less for us imposter syndrome, I think, because my brother and I went to the same university also, and I was several years behind him. So he paved the way for me. So in some ways, my life was very easy. His life was probably much more difficult than mine. I've never asked him, and I should ask him someday. But we went not with the idea that we were not necessarily supposed to be there. We went with the idea that, yeah, we were there, we got in. And so that dealt with that particular issue, and that we expected to make it through. And if anything went wrong along the way, that we would have to call into question, did we do all that we could do to make sure that that didn't happen? And what else might have been going on? There was always a question of, was there something else going on that might have actually also contributed to the shortcomings? I wouldn't say there are any real failures, but the shortcomings. And then how do we deal with that? Some tools around that. And I suggest the same thing for entrepreneurs today. The idea that, I'm a funder. So we fund organizations. We fund organizations at Series A and Series B. And as your listeners are people who know the venture capital play in the world of starting and running businesses, they understand all this. But getting capital, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but once you have the capital, it does not ease the rest of the problems. And particularly if you are a woman, a person of color, LGBTQ plus person, someone who's a bit older in this game, someone who falls outside of the search images, which are the search images, so you don't come from one of the top universities and colleges, and you're not a spin out of something else, is people are not necessarily looking for you, but they're not necessarily looking for you to give you money, nor are they necessarily looking for you when you walk into that organization as a customer that you want to sell your solution to them. Do they say that this is who we'd expect to be bringing us this new solution? Some of that breaks down because, there are lots of salespeople, lots of marketing people, lots of customer success people of various stripes, but still, it's a new thing. You're going to be taking a risk in partnering with you. None of the organizations that we back are organizations that have such incumbent and legacy status that they can say that they have such a track record that they can just point to that track record, and that track record says to other people, oh, you've already sold this to 700 other companies. So, we're just one of a number. Everyone's looking at new technology. Everyone's looking at initial contact. Everyone's looking at first time coming to the market. And so the question of what we can do as a firm to help them, to make sure it's part of our value add, to make sure they can then have a faster onboarding with those customers, and they can amplify and accelerate their successes so their milestones can be reached, so they can go on to the next milestone of, again, raising more money in different ways. Because when they are out there in the world, the isms haven't gone away. They still have to deal with those isms. And how can we help them as people who are a bit farther along on the track to make sure that those isms don't stop them in their tracks?
I am super intrigued about what gives people advantage when they do fight those isms. And I definitely come from a line of fighters. I definitely agree with what you said at the beginning. But before we go into that, I think it's important to understand your transition into venture capitalism. Were you always looking to become a venture capitalist? Was this a dream of yours? Was it an aspiration, or did you, 90% of people that I ask, how did you get into VC? They say I fell into it, but I'm not going to take that as an answer.
Okay. So I'm going to give you a little secret. When I was 18 years old, graduating from high school in the United States, we had moved from Tuskegee in Alabama to Greensboro, North Carolina. So I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, principally, still in the American South. And there was a newspaper, the local newspaper had a profile that it did on a weekly basis of one high school student. And so every week, so they're like 52 a year. And one week they came to me and said, and they ask you a series of questions, and you write in your answers, and then they publish those, and they think of these as up and coming people. And it asked me what career I wanted to be. And I don't know where I got this, probably because I was the kind of person who subscribed. I asked for Christmas once for business, and not for Business Week. So Business Week was just part of like the Newsweek and the Time Warner sort of whole group of newspapers and magazines at some point. I asked for that. And so I got this, and I guess I must have read some articles somewhere about this venture capital world. And for me, the idea of creating businesses sounded fantastic. So I put that in. Not having ever met a venture capitalist, not having ever invested as a venture capitalist, but I said I wanted to be a venture capitalist because it seemed kind of interesting, right? And it seemed a little other. That was part of my brand back then. I wanted to make sure that no one could mistake me for someone who was just sort of traipsing through life like everybody else. I had some other ideas as to what I wanted to do. But you have to fast forward. I didn't start that's in 1980. I didn't start my venture capital firm until 2018. So what is that, 40 years later? Yeah, 40 years later. And so it took that long for me to actually make that happen. Now, during the time, I'd done a number of things and been in touch with a huge number of venture capitalists. And in fact, in school, the only reason I even know this is because I had to think about it. I wrote this book called We Don't Need Permission: How Black Business Can Change Our World. And, it's part of it has to be, sort of what gives you the authority to write a book. And so you have to give some information about yourself. And in this book, in writing it, I had to think back, where did all of this, how did I get to this particular point? Because as you're going through it, you don't sort of say, this point leads to this point leads to that point leads to that point. So I have to piece it together afterward and say, oh, there's a logical progression. There is actually a point at which I said that. And then later on, 40 years later, there's a point at which I am that. And so I would say, though, if I hadn't gone on to law school and disliked it so much and decided not to practice law, I was going to do merger and acquisition law in New York. I was going to be the merger and acquisition lawyer for all the transactions in the United States. A summer doing that, was like, oh, let's not do that. I had a summer of working in a firm where there was a guy who actually worked with fast growth technology companies and other, sort of seed stage, really, companies to help them with their financing and do their financial transactions. Who was a black partner in Atlanta, Georgia, Ted Lackland. And that's what and that sort of, then I began to see a little bit more of what, because that's when I'm in my early 20s. I'm probably 22, 23. And I started to see a little bit about sort of venture capital and how financial markets actually worked. And then I became a strategy consultant after law school, not because I certainly couldn't practice law. And I became a strategy consultant and really worked on high-end transactions, consequential, not in the way that many people who work at places like McKinsey's and BCG's and all those others, but we were working solely on transactional work that involved once in a corporate lifetime activities like mergers, alliances, strategic acquisitions of various assets around the world and that sort of thing. That was what we did. And so I got great access to high level people who were looking for deal making that would be accretive to their balance sheet and or to their general ledger in some way. That then became sort of for me an impetus to think about this kind of business doesn't scale. If you have people delivering services, it just doesn't scale. So what is a nice scalable business? And it was like, I think there is a technology behind this. I don't know anything about the technology, but I think if we could sort of systematize this. And this is about 1999. We're going through the fantastic, sort of internet boom. And so I started a company, and that company ran for about a year, took all of my money, and then we had to go bust when the bubble burst on that particular bubble. And I then took a job with Time Warner as in one of their software units. And that's where I then became my software work and began running those sorts of companies. So there were a bunch of different sorts of events that occurred, and each one created an opportunity. And I think the thing that runs through thread for all of this is saying yes and taking a lot of risk. Because many of the things that I did, it felt at the time like an all or nothing decision. So we're going to be all in. I've decided not to practice law. I've just been to law school for 3 years. I've just graduated, and I'm not going to practice law. That's a huge investment. I came out of school with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to a consulting firm, which I could have done if I hadn't even gone to law school. And then from there, I'm going to spin out another company. And it's like, so it's all or nothing. I'm not going to stay a consultant where I become a partner and I was doing pretty well. I'm going to spin out a company. And then from there, the company's going to go bust. I'm not going to go back to consulting, which I know and had loved. I'm going to go to a big company where I'm going to go so far down. This is just after AOL and Time Warner had actually merged. I'm not going to be even close to decision makers. I was the lowest level of executive in that organization. And then not to be part of the main business that they were doing, but to be part of a backwater. There was a tiny little software company that wasn't near headquarters. It was in Seattle on Lake Union. And so then say that I want to be part of that, to first of all get assigned it and then say, oh no, there's potential here. I want to stay in that. So, but getting away from the center means that you now suddenly are out of the power struggle to get to the top. So, I made a number of those decisions. And part of it is, I have a very strange relationship to risk, obviously, at least in terms of my professional life. And that I felt that at least there were safety nets that either I could employ that I had personally or family or friends or network, whatever it was. So those are some of the things.
I love it. Fascinating. And at the same time, inspiring. I think I have the most amount of time. I deal with a lot of family offices, entrepreneurs that have exits or liquidity events, whether it's deaths in the family or divorces, the big moments in life. And I find that the discussion of risk is one of the most misunderstood. And you said my form of viewing risk is very different. How would you explain risk to someone that has that type of initial liquidity in the bank and says, I got now what do I do?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm going to go back. Now that you're telling me about these family offices, hopefully you tell them about Impact X. That's what we need to be talking about, and that there's good risks that are associated with that. But we'll talk about that.
We're going there.
We'll go there.
I have a bullet right here, ready to shoot.
I think of risk. Risk is always a risk reward analysis, and when you have that liquidity, and I've had a number of liquidity events, and it's what does that give you as a jumping off point for other sorts of things? So liquidity, meaning you have cash in the bank, you can pay down all the debt that you've taken. It's sort of, there's not only the financial debt, but there's all the emotional debt. You've put all of this time away from your friends and family and other sorts of things you've neglected. You've neglected your body, you've neglected your health. So after you have gotten back to a steady state, having taken some of that liquidity entity and then righted the wrongs that have been created over the last period of time, then you have to say always what's next. Because, there is, unless you plan on hanging it up right there, and then that's going to be it. And I've done everything that I'm going to do. And I never want to have, at least in my life, any more impact, because I think I've done sufficiently and the world's a better place because I've existed and done what I did this last time. And so there's nothing else for me to do. Then you've got to then say, I'm probably in a place, and probably the best place ever, to take a big risk now. I'm as young as I'm ever going to be. I'm likely as healthy as I'm ever going to be. And so if I take a big swing, it could go all horribly wrong. But then what does that actually mean, horribly wrong? It could be very unsuccessful. But even if it's unsuccessful, I have all sorts of reserves in terms of, again, network. I have all sorts of reserve in terms of my own set of skills. I have a little bit of capital on the side, and then I can probably start over. And I'm not going to do this based on getting older. I also have a whole group of people that I've done other things with. I've made money for other people. I have employed other people, given them a great resume, some other people. So in some ways, if I were looking at the favors and ledgers that exist on my risk balance sheet, it's like, well, maybe I can get some of those people to actually work with me, or maybe they can provide a new opportunity, or maybe they are the answer to some sort of a need that I have within the next sort of an impact-oriented step that I'm going to take in life. And so I would say that I find, at least from my risk profile, that every time I have a liquidity event, I take a breath, and then I have to ask, how big a swing am I ready to take at something else?
I will crop this out and send it to people, because I think I find the opposite to be true. I find entrepreneurs that took incredible risks to do what they did, once they become liquid, they become super conservative. And they're like, now I'm going to go all protection and everything has to be protected. And it took me so much work to get there. And I'm like, I understand. I am an entrepreneur that sold this business, and I know the story behind that capital. And the capital represents effort, sleepless nights, divorces. It's very costly to get to that point.
Absolutely.
But I love the idea of saying maybe some has to go into reserve, network, whatever you want, but take a big swing as well. I like that.
I also think, Ahmad, I haven't had children. I've got 12 godchildren. I got a lot of kids in my life, but I don't have children who I'm planning a legacy for, which I'm planning a specific legacy for. So if indeed that isn't the case, and so I'm not doing it about that, and I have a partner in life who is healthy on his own and he's doing what he's doing, and so I don't need to necessarily put aside for that. And then the question is, so what to do? And I find it very exciting, but I agree with you. Many people would say the climb was really, really hard. And I don't necessarily want to do that again. But then for those people, I think their climb was a different climb than I was taking. The climb I'm taking is to have impact. The interesting thing about it is it's come with a great deal of financial opportunity and success. But it wasn't for the sake of getting to a certain kind of a dollar point and then retiring and saying that now I need to hold on to that, like, with a death grip. It was intended to be impacting the Mayan world in positive ways. And again, if part of my definition of success is, then have I had enough impact? Well, I can say after each one of those liquidity events, I haven't had enough impact. The world continues to create their problems and other sorts of things that could be solved. And so I continue to be in the situation where there's so much opportunity. It's like there's a squirrel, like a dog chasing a bone, or a squirrel looking at various nuts. It's like, oh my goodness, there's that and there's that and there's that. And so therefore I should do something else. And my thing has been with Impact X, trying to increase the amount of resource that I have. I mean, I only have the amount of resource that I have, but to try and then consolidate pooled capital to do something and to get people behind that same idea and pooling our capital to make those sorts of impacts. And that's always going to be a new level that I have to get to. That's always going to have to be a new opportunity I'm going to have to pursue. It's always going to be a new goal that I'm going to have to set. I think I've just constructed a life and constructed sort of a sense of purpose that's based on probably an inability to say, I'm done. Let me put all my sort of gold together and let me hold on to it in the most conservative fashion possible. It's not how it started, and I can't therefore imagine that's how it ends.
And what I get from what you're saying, and it just came to my mind that if you chase money,
Mhm.
you will always be disappointed.
Mm.
If
Now,
you,
I haven't had that experience yet of chasing money only, so maybe those people aren't disappointed. Maybe this is just my imagination. But yes, I would say that there's a way in which there's always more money that you can get, and if you get that money, holding on to it becomes a goal on it in itself.
in itself, yeah. But if you chase purpose, you might feel more satisfied, and the money becomes the kind of like the middle, not the end. Whereas if money is the end and purpose is the middle,
Mm.
if you hit, like if the purpose is to make money, I think it's always going to be, it's always never going to be enough. And I think that the spiral becomes that death grip that you mentioned.
Mhm.
It's funny. It's a funny word because I don't know if death has a grip.
Mhm.
You might lose it all.
That's true. It's an interesting conversation. I mean, I hadn't expected us to have a philosophic conversation like this. It's fascinating. It's good to actually sort of make this a conversation that forces me to think about these things in a philosophic fashion, as opposed to just, you listen to so many podcasts, Ahmad, and I don't know whether this is how I've been listening to all the podcasts that you've done. So this has to probably do as much with you as it has to do with me. But how many you listen is just a sort of a regurgitating of people's successes and sort of the things that have happened and some of their failures. It's all, everyone has those failures, and that makes for an interesting story. But it's always the narrative that you feel people are telling a lot, that they've said that narrative many, many, many times, whether it be at the dinner table or whether it be in a panel discussion or whether it be at a fireside chat. They've said that many times. This is interesting. This is interesting because it's not what I think about. So you're now forcing me to think on the spot also. So I got to get ready.
I appreciate
The
that.
next question is going to be,
I take it as a compliment. I think that when I change my philosophy, or when I think about philosophy in the way that I allocate capital, I don't need to see the product because I understand the frame of thought. And the frame of thought to me has always been an eye-opening of how the person is, more than the elevator pitch or how they've been able to regurgitate their successes before and be like, I want to ask you about, you invested into the second black unicorn in Europe, which is Marshmallow, right?
correct.
And that is a incredible accomplishment. But now I understand why you saw it, right? But let's go into Impact X a little bit deeper. What is the future of Impact X? What's on the plate right now, and what are you seeing as opportunities that you think more people should hear about?
That is a good opportunity. So Impact X is, first of all, a double bottom line fund, meaning that our primary focus is venture scaled and venture time, top quartile, top decile returns on investment for our institutional, and we have a few individual investors, but really our institutional investors who are the basis of our fund. Secondarily, we believe that it is extremely important to actually influence how the world looks, and we do it by job creation. So we measure our success by how much money we have put back into the hands of our institutional investors for whatever it is that they're doing with that capital. And we love it when they're an endowment. We love when they're a foundation, and some of the good work that we're generating the capital so that they can actually do that. But we also love when they're corporations. And then secondarily, we want to make sure that we are choosing organizations that are building businesses that have people who are getting opportunities. And that they're not just getting opportunities in the apprenticeship program, that they're getting opportunities on the board, as founders, in the C-suite and P&L responsible roles, and within the engineering organizations, as these are mostly technology companies. That's how we measure success. So how many jobs do we create? Especially how much money do we actually make available for the missions of the organizations for whom we are investing their capital into a variety of private companies. We have been doing that since 2018. And we started because someone said, if you look at Britain as a society, if you look at the UK, 1 in 2 Black children in the UK live below the poverty line. Wait a second. So you say to yourself, 1 in 2? So 50% of those children live below the poverty line in a country which is considered a great place to live, has a great social net to make sure that, if you fall through the cracks and you're not able to make it in the world in one way, the safety net makes sure you get to survive with dignity. But still, 1 in 2 Black children. This is before COVID. This is before rampant and galloping inflation, and also before the cost of living crisis here, just after Brexit, and before Brexit had actually been fully implemented. So that's when we got started. But it was a very exuberant time in the market, if you remember. And we got started with people raising lots of money. And we found it hard to raise capital, except in our very first fund. Our very first fund was made up of a number of people who were sort of in our ecosystem who said, we want to put our money behind this idea that we can prove that if you invest in differentiated deal flow, you can get both of those double bottom lines, both return on investment as well as job creation. So those people put money in, and they were from the United States, both coasts of the United States, as well as the UK, as well as France. So these are people, and everyone was Black actually in the first fund. And everyone put in the same amount of money basically the same amount of money in order to sort of back this idea and see whether or not we could show returns. And we were able to do that. So you mentioned Marshmallow. That was one of the organizations in our first fund. It's an insurtech company, which is most fascinating, not because it's an insurtech company, but it's an insurtech company that is actually insuring immigrants into the UK. So people who come to the UK from another location come to the UK without a driving record attached to their driving license. That means that if they're going to get auto insurance, it's going to often be 5 times in terms of premium, the cost of what a person who has a domestic driving record is able to get. In any case, they are able to, using a series of tools, to match a person with a driving record and then put that into their profile as they're looking for comparing insurance policies, and able to get them much better rates. So Marshmallow started by British Jamaican identical twins, Oliver and Alexander Kenbrahim. And we had done a study because we felt that there was a gap in the marketplace in insurance, and that in fact, if you looked at insurance as an industry where there's lots and lots of capital sloshing around, there was not a lot of innovation sloshing around. And so we looked at about 25 companies around Europe and the UK, identified about 5 that had characteristics that we really liked, and then started to talk to 2 of those, one being Marshmallow. They had actually had an oversubscribed round. We were able to talk our way in through the value add that we were going to bring, and we were able to get into a round. And they were 30 million pre-money valuation, and 18 months later, they were 1.2 billion. And earlier in Q2 of this year, they announced a $90 million round that was included BlackRock and Columbia Lake Partners at a $2 billion valuation. So they've continued to grow. I would say those are all great metrics. And certainly for my fundraising, it makes a lot of sense, right? And for our impact, it's great to say that they're working with immigrants. That immigrants are who they work with. They work with other people who are young drivers and the like, but it's really those immigrants that have driven that. And these are people who are vilified in many countries. Think about the United States. Think about here. Some people want to build walls. Other people want to send the boats back. But these are the people who are actually driving this business model. And very importantly, this organization has been able to continue to grow. It has hundreds of employees. 50% are women, 20% are people of color in those key roles that we're talking about. Everything from the engineering organization straight through to P&L responsible roles. That's what we want to see. So while those young men have made the rich list, they have also made, at least on paper, many of the people in their companies they've given them life-changing access to capital themselves, which fits into our idea of having a virtuous circle where those people come out, they've made their money via investing in being part of a fast growth technology company. They're likely to invest their money, and they're part of one that was run by 2 people of color. They're likely to invest in those sorts of spaces. And they're also people of color themselves and women. They're likely to invest. So this flywheel that you get, where more capital is in the hands of decision makers who I think make a different sets of decisions. I don't care and Impact X is very agnostic as to whether those people actually use the money to pay off their student loans, to buy a house, to back a philanthropy, or to buy a plane. We don't necessarily care. But what we have found, there's a study done called Giving Black, that those people have a tendency to to do charitable work, as well as put their major money into things which have a similar value set as the one that we have. And I would say, can I go on for one other second, Ahmad? I want to talk about another thing that we've done. So another thing that we've done is we look for places where underrepresented people. So I named these groups before. So people of color, women, LGBTQ+, older entrepreneurs, disabled entrepreneurs. We look for places where people like that over-index in terms of their participation in sectors. And we are looking for sectors, therefore, that have deep pools of talent. People have been in them for years. They're in leading positions. They have the ability to sort of understand how these sectors work and what doesn't work and where they could actually innovate. And we invest in digital and technology, health, education, well-being. Those are pretty typical for venture capital firms. we also invest in media and entertainment, but not just in media and entertainment. Although we'll invest in gaming and that sort of thing, we invest in projects which are creative projects. Because many people of color, women, LGBTQ plus, disabled people, are in that industry and have been making waves for generations. So the question of, can we actually get a venture scale return, and can we actually influence who's in front of the camera, who's behind the camera, who's in front of the tape deck, who's behind the tape, all of those sorts of things is part of what we do. And we have a good example of that in this first portfolio, a company called Ianu. Ianu is not a company, it's a project. And if you have children between the ages of maybe 11 and 16, they might know Ianu, because Ianu is the #1 animated series on the Cartoon Network in the United States, as well as on HBO Max. And we developed this project. We found this project on Kickstarter. And we then came in and said to the founder in this situation, the creative, and said, we think we can do something with this. You've been publishing these graphic novels, and you have an universe that rivals the DC universe and the Marvel universe of all these characters that are based principally in Africa and that have this thing in common called Yorubaland that they're trying to impact. And that if we can actually, it's not Gotham and it's not, Metropolis, it is Yorubaland. And if we were to take this, we think that we can actually create an animated series that could actually really change narrative and create the kind of return our LPs are interested in. And we've been able to do that. So last quarter, Warner Brothers Discovery, which is the owner of both Cartoon Network as well as HBO Max, greenlit a second season as well as 2 films. And we also have merchandising deals. So this is an example, and those things create quite a substantial return on investment. And that's by thinking a little bit differently in terms of what are the industries and sectors, but also think about who we think is going to give us that sort of return. That has been one of the advantages of being part of Impact X and being one of these sorts of organizations that's really working very hard to say that you shouldn't follow the crowd in terms of all of your investing. There are ways that the crowd might lead us in good directions, but there are others that don't. I mean, we've invested recently in a organization called Quantum Dice. This is a company that was started by a young man and colleagues who were a spin out of Oxford University. Oxford University, there's nothing novel and there's nothing differentiated about investing in spin out from Oxford University. So let's be clear. But this is a man of color, and he is working in quantum science. And in terms of the company he has called Quantum Dice, they have discovered a way to get true random number generation. And if you think about it, random numbers are necessary for everything, the functioning of cybersecurity. The applications are far and wide. And this is an organization that has been looking at that problem and has actually come up with a hardware-software combination that we're working on shrinking that down to the size that it could fit on any sort of wafer, any silicon chip. And you can imagine with that kind of safety protocol that's then available, that is chip size, and the ability for that then to be going around the world, that's the kind of company that we want to see, because we believe that could revolutionize everything that has a chip in it. And that the application of that particular solution is absolutely astonishing and great and will influence the world. And because this person of color has started this organization and is sitting in a very competitive space and has been working now with companies like AT&T in the United States, as well as banks here, HSBC here in the UK, we think that we have found what will be an organization that folks will be talking about going forward. But we have a number of these. In Sweden, we have a company called Setasol that is looking at how they can make sure, again, there's a device plus there's software, how we can make sure that we're having fleets of ships to find the best route to get, and the fastest route and the most fuel efficient route to get from point A to point Z. So this is all those ships that are plying the oceans. They're working on how to make sure that they get there most efficiently and save as much possible. We have a company in Israel actually called Babies. It's looking at how do we actually work on male infertility. Question, can you use robotics, use artificial intelligence to do that? So can you use both a computer vision approach as well as a robot that actually uses a pipette in order to be able to choose the best sperm to actually fertilize eggs, so that we reduce the cost we reduce the cost of overcoming infertility, and particularly focusing on male as opposed to what we are generally focusing on, which is female infertility. So there are a bunch of these organizations, and there are a bunch of these creative projects. In our second fund, we've just closed a health tech company in New York, which took us to 20 in our second fund, which we've been investing since 2023. So we're very pleased with what we're seeing. We're very pleased with the differentiated deal flow. And we're very pleased with the results that they're getting as they raise additional capital in order to be able to go, having hit their milestones, going on to the next set of milestones. So it's been a rewarding experience, and thinking about differentiated and thinking about spots that other people aren't looking in terms of who they would target and what they would be targeting is one of the things that is supposed to be the basis of venture capital. But I seem to notice a lot of follow the herd and the flock approach. And we are sort of one of those organizations that say that we can do something much, much differently.
You remind me of a quote that says, it was in The Gentleman. It was like, you had my curiosity, but now you have my attention, because I think what you've done is
I remember that
unbelievable.
Quote. Thank you.
I think that I wish we had 3 hours to talk, because we can go so much deeper and there's so much more to do. But this is the point of the podcast, is to show people how their return on identity is infinite. Mm-hmm. And what you've done is an example of that. And what people, I will put in the description for people to keep learning from you, to look for you online, and then hopefully learn about your fund and the things you're doing, because everything sounds incredibly exciting. And if you're drawn to impact, I think that is a great way to be part of what you're doing. Thank you again for coming.
Ahmad, thank you for having me. And thanks for the conversation. The sort of questions and the inquiry has been, for me, also eye-opening. I've enjoyed it tremendously. And thanks for taking the time.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you again.